Okay, good afternoon. My presentation today is called The Logical Way to Teach Introduction to Philosophy. And I suppose I should preface by saying that I was an original member of the Teachership Academy 4 or 5 years ago when it began. And I had an initial exposure to action research at that time, and I kind of had to feel my way around the entire process. It was something that was new to me, and it was something that I was kind of learning as I went along. And so it was an enjoyable experience, but one where I was still kind of a little confused as to the process. And so this time around, I kind of wanted to take the opportunity, having the experience that I had had several years previously, to try and, have a more grounded, solid approach. And so I asked if I could change my topic, and I was given permission, and so I embraced the opportunity. And given that my research interests had changed over the years, I wanted to kind of change direction a little bit. I think that when I had first graduated from the Teachership Academy, I was a relatively new instructor, still kind of trying to find my way as a teacher in the classroom. And it was shortly after I graduated, in fact the summer afterwards, that I attended a conference for the American Association of Philosophy Teachers. And I attended a presentation where the presenter asked the question, as philosophy instructors, what should we be teaching, in particular in introductory philosophy courses? Should we focus on content or skills? And this was a question that I had struggled with in the brief career that I had had at EPCC up to that point. And so as a philosophy instructor, we're sort of faced with this dilemma here. Should we teach the great ideas of famous figures throughout the history of philosophy, or should we teach students how to philosophize, the skills that are required in order to solve philosophical problems? Now, as I mentioned, I think that this is actually a false dilemma. I believe that really we don't have to make a choice. Really, ideally, what we want to do is teach both. Now, the teaching of the great figures and the great ideas, the content is pretty much standard. I think that there's really no problem there. But what I found challenging was teaching students the necessary skills in order to philosophize. I think that that was definitely something that was new to them. Logic and critical thinking was something that they hadn't really had much of in their previous education, and so I wanted to try to focus on how I could teach that effectively. So having decided this approach, I wanted to ask then, how do I teach logic in my introductory course? Now, the challenge that I initially faced was that most textbooks for introductory philosophy courses treat logic only briefly, and usually at the beginning of the textbook. There's a few chapters, maybe just one or maybe even just a section or two in the first chapter that talks about logic. And a lot of the time, they don't really teach the nuts and bolts of logic. They just kind of focus more on it as a branch of the discipline philosophy. But I think that treating it as a separate unit resulted in certain problems that I saw my students facing. One was they tended to forget the logic as the course went on. And I think it was because they weren't consistently applying it. Even though perhaps I was referencing it, even though that I would bring up these concepts here and there, it wasn't something that I was explicitly trying to do, and I feel as though since they thought it was not necessary or unessential, they just forgot about it. So that was a big challenge that I wanted to try to address. Next, I feel that if they don't apply it, they really don't leave the class, the course rather, with that knowledge, that understanding, and they can't apply it. And I think as philosophy instructors, what we want to do is teach critical reasoning skills to our students so that they can apply it to whatever it is that they want to go on and study, be it nursing, be it cosmetology, be it history, whatever. I think that critical thinking skills learned in philosophy are applicable to whatever it is that the student wants to go on and study. And I also felt that students were not seeing logic as a tool that they could use to help them. they saw it more as a body of knowledge that they could just memorize, and once the first test was over, clear out of their mind, forget. And I think that that was frustrating me as an instructor of philosophy. And so what I next did was try to focus on different ways to teach students logic and critical reasoning. Fortunately, doing a literature review, I discovered an article by a philosopher named Donald Gregory in the journal Teaching Philosophy called Teaching Logic in Introductory Philosophy. And I think that's one of the beauties of action research. You don't have to come up with an innovative research topic. You can sort of see if your question has been asked before and build on the previous work that's been done by colleagues. Gregory asks, instead of isolating logic from the rest of the course in a separate unit, wouldn't it be preferable to introduce it piecemeal as it naturally arises in the context of discussing problems? So the question then becomes the basis of my inquiry. So I decided that I would use a traditional textbook in which the early sections in logic are brief but adequate, and I would try to sort of space out the material throughout the course. So I identified, and this was influenced by Gregory as well, the topics that were most relevant. And these included deduction and induction, validity, classical argument forms, and so on. And I think that what I tried to do then was, how should I incorporate them throughout the course? Again, Gregory argues it would seem preferable to show them in context. And so this is ideally what I tried to do. For example, when discussing epistemology, I focus on the distinction between deduction and induction. When discussing proofs for the existence of God, I discuss the nature of proofs. In discussing Hume, for example, on induction, I discuss the pleasures and pitfalls of induction. And so Gregory was sort of the jumping off point for me, and it became the basis of my action. So what I tried to do was apply Gregory's approach in my courses. One immediate advantage that I found was that I was able to see that students were less likely to be overwhelmed by the material. Instead of pummeling them at the beginning of the semester with these concepts, I could spread it out over the course of the class, and they could grasp the concepts a little bit more easily. My innovation was to come up with logic exercises to assign as homework and collect them throughout the semester. The next step that I did was to develop exam questions specifically designed to assess the comprehension of the logical method. The way that I did this was I asked a series of short essay questions on each exam, 2 based on the content in which I supplemented with logic and exercises, and 2 based on subject matter in which no logic was explicitly taught. I graded the logic supplemented questions with a specially designed rubric focusing on the logical concepts. Now, what I did was I came up with 2 sets of exams, an exam A which featured the logic questions and an exam B which did not. The exam B then served as a control group. So the intention, ultimately, is to assess the results of the action by examining the scores on the midterm and the final. The results are going to be compared, and the data will be collected at the end of this semester. Since I barely began the project at the beginning of the academic year, it won't be drawn to a conclusion until after this current semester. With these specific questions embedded throughout my exams, I'm able to collect the data and compare them and see whether or not my new approach and my action research project was successful or not.